I'm Frances Stewart, and I'm an emeritus professor at Oxford University. I think it's definitely something else, certainly as used in this centre, because diversity is simply a descriptive term that you have people, different people, and all societies are diverse in one respect or another. Maybe it's in ethnicity, maybe it's in religion, maybe both, and so on. So you have diverse societies everywhere. Pluralism is a way of managing these diverse societies in a way that makes people respect difference and enjoy being different whilst at the same time feeling that they're part of a national project. So pluralism consists in all those institutions and processes by which you can make this happen. Now, it's very distinct from other ways of managing a society. For example, there is a move in Europe to try and make everyone integrate into a single identity. And to be a citizen, you have to know how many wives Henry VIII had and that sort of thing. Otherwise, it doesn't count. And the religious holidays are all British and so on. And that is a very attempt to make a diverse situation homogeneous, whereas a pluralistic approach is very different. It's that everyone is respected for their own identity, and at the same time they adhere to the national identity. I think it's very difficult to give a single answer to that, because if you asked me about my own society at the moment, it's immigration, which is a driver of exclusion, and it's politics and values, which are a driver of exclusion. So putting that the other way around, for inclusion, I think having inclusive politics and inclusive values is a fundamental issue. But having said that, you haven't really answered the question at all, because where do these values come from? You can't just create values. So you have to look at the underlying institutional basis of the values, the underlying history, the politics, and so on. So at the end of the day, to say values is the most important doesn't tell you what is the most important, and then you have to get underneath it. And when you get underneath it, I think you find that this is going to vary in different societies depending on their particular situation. I think that inequalities in access to political resources and in access to economic resources are fundamentally important, where these inequalities are between particular cultural groups. So if one group, let's say Muslims, have many fewer resources than the Christians, they do less well economically, they have less good educational levels, and at the same time they have less good access to the politics of a country, that is going to be a big driver of a big obstacle to pluralism. On the other hand, if people are treated, broadly speaking, equally, each group has, broadly speaking, equal access to political power and to economic power, then we're going to have the foundations for a good pluralistic society. But then there might be another society in which you have a different sort of history. You have a situation in which one group has got a majority and is oppressing a minority, and that is going to be a major obstacle, and one which is difficult to get round, because in a democratic society that majority will have a majority of votes, and you really need to think in a very subtle and sophisticated way about what sort of political system you can put into effect which would stop that majority dominating the whole situation. Inequalities in economic resources are a fundamental issue. But the fundamental issue is that it's inequality between groups. That is to say, you have some important groups in a society. It might be a racial group, it might be ethnic, it might be religious, it might even be geographic, which are doing much better than others. And at the same time, they have a sort of difference in identity. The difference in identity being precisely that they have a different ethnicity, a different culture. A different feeling of belonging to different groups. And then you put these two things together, so you have a feeling of belonging to a particular group, and at the same time some groups doing much better than others, and that's very explosive, because it's very easy to mobilize people politically by their group. You're can appeal to them by their group. They feel a sense of identity and they can be mobilized if the leaders want to mobilize them. So it's that coincidence of culture and the distribution of resources which can be a fundamentally mobilizing resource. And my own view is that if you want a peaceful society, you have to have fair equality between major groups in a society. And as soon as you get big divergences, you have problems. But you need to also combine that with differences in access to political resources. Because groups feel very strongly about how their group's doing politically. And there's some good reasons for that. Partly it's they have a sense of identity, so their person is in power, so they feel that's good. You know, we are respected. So there's a real sense of that. At the same time, in most societies, not in all, whoever's in power gives jobs for their own group and so on. So there are real economic benefits from having your group in power and real economic costs from not having your group in power. So that the politics is very important, and it's important sort of symbolically. Some of the research that we've done shows that the way that people feel they're doing economically as a group depends much more on how they're actually doing politically than how they're actually doing economically. They don't actually know how they're doing economically in relation to other people, and they sometimes get it quite wrong. But if they see that they're being deprived politically, then they interpret that to mean we must be doing worse economically. So it's very explosive. So putting those things together is sort of economic and political anxieties or resource access combined with differences in cultural identity is very bad for achieving a pluralistic society. Well, it's not just a question of the average level of well-being. You get some very poor societies which are pretty pluralistic, really. I'll give you an example, is Tanzania. Many different identities, very, very poor, no conflict, and on the whole, a feeling of belonging to that society. So it's not just poverty. And put the other way around, you get some rich societies, like, let's say, Northern Ireland, in which has got, you know, the levels of income of a developed country, but for many years had a lot of conflict. So it's not the absolute level of well-being. I think one has to be clear about that. It's the distribution which matters so much. So it is a question of inclusion and exclusion. It's a question of some groups doing much better than others. It's a question of inequalities, much more than it is a question of absolute levels of well-being. And interestingly, when you look at what actually causes conflict, which is, of course, the final breakdown in pluralist society, but when you find what causes conflict, it's not always the poor group, which is, there's a sort of model in one's mind. Poor people have a grievance, they fight against the rich group, that's what causes the conflict. That's not always at all the picture. Quite often it's the rich group who want to preserve their riches, and they think, well, we really need to suppress these poor people. So they sort of preemptively attack the poor. So it's inequality, it's not just a question of worrying about exclusion. If you like, it's over-inclusion of the rich, which can also be a cause of a lack of pluralism in your society. It's a very interesting question. And it's also interesting in a way whether religion is emerging as a special cleavage or whether it isn't religious differences in a way within a religion. Because if we look at the way people are being mobilized around the world at the moment, it's not, if you take Syria and so on, it's not the whole of Islam. It's a very small subsect of Islam which is fighting. And I think what one finds is, and this is more a general issue about religion, that religion in some ways is just an identity, just like being a member of a particular ethnic group or a particular racial group, a sort of club to which people belong. Now, is it any different from any other club? And I think that's the basic question you're asking. And in some ways it is, and in some ways it's not. In some ways it is not, you know, that if you were a Hutu or Tutsi, to use the Rwanda case, being a Hutu or Tutsi has obviously been a very powerful mobilizing issue, and very powerful and very damaging, as we know from the genocide there. So ethnicity can be hugely damaging. Religious differences can also mobilize. Sometimes they mobilize along with ethnicity. Sometimes they are, in fact, some groups have the same ethnicity and the same religion, and other groups different on both counts. And that is obviously particularly damaging because there's so little relationship between the two. And in those cases, then it's religion which seems to be the mobilizing device. It's not so different from the ethnicity. So let me come back to the question, are there differences? I think there are some. One difference is a rather prosaic difference, a difference in organization and finance. Religions tend to have a lot of formal organization, which makes it sort of in a way easier for them to organize conflict, easier for them to stand apart from others. Second difference, which I think is really becoming very important, is that religions are global phenomena, and other differences on the whole are not global. So what you find is that you have Muslims in many, many parts of the world. It's a global religion. There are very many different subsects. It's not a homogeneous religion, but it's a global one. And people feel a sense of identity to that global entity. And there's a lot of mixing across the world of people moving from one place to another, of British Muslims moving to particular conflict sites, of remittances all over the world, of everybody joining in the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and so on. So there's a lot of sense of identity at a global level. And what this means is that when you do have problems, the problems can be made much worse by the global connections. The global connections, they can call on global resources, they can move globally, and that is very disintegrating for the nation state, which is the way we normally think of a pluralistic society as being a national society. In a sense, because of the global nature of religion, we need to think of pluralism at a global level, which is much more of a challenge. And then a final difference, I'd say, which makes religion in some ways more problematic than other differences, is that particular religions, they have all sorts of demands on one, as one knows, one's religion says you shouldn't do this, shouldn't do that. And it makes it much more difficult for people to mix across. For example, some may be having their Sabbath one day and some may be having another and some another. Dietary habits are different. Many religions really prohibit marriage across different religions. So there's much more separation across religions. For example, in some of the African countries that I've studied, there's a lot of intermarriage. It's quite, although one talks a lot about ethnic disputes and ethnic wars and all that, in fact, each ethnic group is very fluid, and at the margin, there are a lot of people have the result of marriages across. So there's a lot. But then you come to religion, and you find you don't get that. And I mean, just to talk about another society, which is a very interesting one in my view, which is Malaysia, which has avoided conflict for many years through very progressive policies towards the distribution of resources. So, I was talking about inequality of access to resources. They've done very well on that. And in a way, they're a very successful society. They have very good growth rate. They've moved from being a poor country to a rich country. They've industrialized. I mean, they're admirable. But I wouldn't call them a pluralist society. And the reason I wouldn't call them a pluralist is when you go there, it's more like a silo society. They do not talk across the divisions. There's the Malays, the Indians, the Chinese. They each have their different religion. They do not marry across. They do not mix across. If you wander around into a university and you look at the students, and they're all sitting in their different tables, you see the Chinese students, the Malay students, the Indian students. So it's not what I'd call a pluralistic society, although, it's working, it's peaceful, but it isn't pluralistic. So I think religion is a particular challenge. They certainly challenge models of the secular state. There's no question. That is precisely what Islam at the moment is trying to do to challenge that model. And I think if in challenging it, they are particularly challenging pluralism, because there isn't room for pluralism in an Islamic state. May not be so far as to enforce very fierce Sharia law everywhere, but it does enforce that everyone has to be a Muslim. And so I think in terms of the pluralistic agenda, yeah, if they win, so to speak, there's a real conflict between that and the pluralist view of society.